A relatively small percentage of wartime comic books focused primarily on military action. Unlike war comics of the 1950s and later, comic books published during World War II, especially their covers, were generally less violent and less realistic, in keeping with both the official and unofficial strictures on war-related content in media, and the tamer nature of pop culture overall. One of the most successful wartime military comics was Military Comics, which lasted just over 4 years from August 1941 until October 1945, at which time the title changed to Modern Comics and the story switched to Peacetime Adventures. The masthead of Military Comics informed readers that the publication featured stories of the Army and Navy, although in fact relatively few of the recurring characters were portrayed as official members of the armed forces carrying out their regular duties. The cover feature on all 43 issues of Military Comics was Black Hawk, discussed in Part 1 of this episode. Other popular military action comics included 3 titles from Fiction House, one of the most adult-oriented comic book publishers of the war years. Once the war began, Fight, Rangers, and Wings comics largely eschewed costume superheroes in favor of fairly normal soldiers, sailors, aviators, and the occasional soldier of fortune, spy, or globe-trotting adventurer. Beginning in the summer of 1942, Fight comics mostly featured Rip Carson's Shoot Trooper on the cover. Carson was a regular uniformed member of the United States Army who participated in dangerous missions, mostly against enemy armed forces rather than supervillains. Captain Morgan and the U.S. Rangers, more uniformed members of the armed forces, were the primary cover stars of Rangers comics during wartime. Wings comics, as the title would suggest, specialized in aviation stories. Captain Wings, a secret American air ace, was a featured cover name, along with the Skull Squad, Clipper Kirk, and other flying heroes, but the cover art focused primarily on detailed images of military aircraft in combat rather than on any particular recognizable human character. Other wartime comic books feature generic combat action on their covers, and at least some war-oriented content inside, although in some cases other story genres were included. A small but significant subset of wartime comic books was dedicated to true stories of both historical and current events. Obviously, the war featured prominently on the covers of many of these publications. Many of the stories featured biographies of prominent military leaders, both American and Allied, but there were also stories about notable contemporary heroes and their combat exploits. Not all wartime comics featured scenes of life-or-death struggles involving superheroes, the armed forces, Axis villains, and German and Japanese troops. Even during wartime, the lighter side of military service was featured in a number of comic books. Terrytoon Comics was based on the animated cartoon series produced by Paul Terry. Prominent on the covers were Gandy Goose and Sourpuss Cat in their wartime incarnations as members of the U.S. Army. Other comic book covers depicted existing characters serving in the armed forces for the duration. These included Boxer Joe Palooka, Hillbilly Snuffy Smith, Secretary Tilly the Toiler, and Lollapalooza and her lazy brother Vincent. There were also numerous wartime comic books with gag or one-shot covers depicting military humor. One interesting wartime phenomenon was the creation of comic books aimed chiefly at service personnel, although many were also available to the general public. Most of these were packaged by the Harry A. Chesler Shop and published by Chicago publisher Remington Morse or its New York affiliate William H. Wise. A number of these were digest-sized rather than the standard comic book dimensions, and some sold for as little as a nickel. Wartime comic book publishers had to balance commerce with propaganda. Comic book covers had to attract buyers, and if a patriotic message could also be conveyed, so much the better. Images of the American Armed Forces posed some special challenges, since comics were primarily an entertainment medium whose readership was skewed towards children, teenagers, and young people. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and other service personnel were to be admired and respected. Even humorous comics didn't poke fun at the underlying institution of the armed forces. And yet these sentiments had to be conveyed in an exciting manner which would encourage people to purchase the comic books in the first place.